Dr. William Harper was more than just a doctor to the people of Greystone, he was a lifeline. In a town where everyone knew everyone, his name was spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints. His reputation had grown steadily over the years, built on countless acts of kindness, tireless dedication, and an unwavering commitment to his patients. When someone fell ill, the first thought was always the same: call Dr. Harper. He arrived with his leather medical bag in hand and a reassuring smile on his face. His voice, soft and steady, was enough to calm the most anxious patient. Parents trusted him with their children. The elderly depended on him to ease their final days. To everyone in Greystone, he was more than a healer, he was family. His work went beyond the clinic. He delivered babies, his hands gentle and sure as he guided new life into the world. Mothers wept with joy as he placed their infants into their arms, his voice filled with warmth as he said, "Your baby is healthy and strong." At funerals, he stood in quiet solidarity, offering kind words to grieving families. Even in the darkest moments, his presence brought light. The townsfolk saw him as the glue holding their community together. At church on Sundays, he sat in the front pew, bowing his head humbly during prayers. He never missed a community event, whether it was a fundraiser for the school or a town picnic. If someone couldn't pay for their medical treatment, Dr. Harper would simply wave it off. "Your health is more important," he'd say with a kind smile. People admired his calm, his steadiness, and his ability to make even the most serious situations feel manageable. "Dr. Harper will take care of it," they said. And he always did, or so it seemed. For 20 years, Greystone had trusted him without question. His warm demeanor and gentle voice became symbols of safety. To many, he was more than just a doctor, he was a man they could depend on in their most vulnerable moments. But trust can be a dangerous thing. Beneath Dr. Harper's calm exterior lay a secret. A dark, terrifying truth that no one in Greystone could have imagined. Dr. Harper's day always began the same way. At sunrise, he'd walk to the small clinic on Main Street, greeting everyone he passed. He knew the names of shop owners, children, and even the stray cats that roamed the town square. His charm was effortless, his manners impeccable. "Good morning, Mrs. Dawson," he'd say to the baker's wife as she set out fresh bread. "How's your back feeling?" "Better, I hope." "Much better, thanks to you, doctor," she'd reply, her face lighting up. To anyone watching, Dr. Harper's life seemed full of purpose and goodwill. Patients came and went throughout the day, their faces often leaving brighter than when they arrived. He listened carefully to their concerns, took their hands when they were afraid, and always seemed to know the right words to say. But his nights told a different story. When the clinic closed and the streets of Greystone grew quiet, Dr. Harper stayed behind. The lights in his office remained on long after everyone else had gone home. He claimed he was catching up on paperwork or preparing for the next day. No one questioned it. Why would they? Yet, if someone had been bold enough to look closer, they might have seen a different side of him. A side that was cold and methodical. A side that revealed the man behind the mask. For years, no one in Greystone had reason to doubt Dr. Harper. He had delivered their children, treated their illnesses, and comforted their loved ones in their final hours. But this trust was what made his secret so terrifying. Behind the kind smile and soft voice was a man with a darkness so deep that it defied understanding. Dr. Harper wasn't just a doctor. He was something else entirely. The truth was buried under layers of charm and carefully crafted lies. No one saw the way his eyes lingered a little too long on certain patients. No one noticed the way his voice sometimes grew cold when he thought no one was listening. And no one questioned the patients who seemed to simply disappear. Greystone had nurtured a monster without knowing it. They had welcomed him into their homes, shared their lives with him, and trusted him with their secrets. But Dr. Harper had secrets of his own, secrets that, if revealed, would shatter the very foundation of the town's trust. The signs were there, if anyone had cared to look. A file misplaced here, a question unanswered there. Late night walks to the edge of town, where no one could see him. Locked drawers in his office that no one dared to open. Yet, people brushed these things aside. After all, this was Dr. Harper. He wasn't just any man, he was their doctor. The one who saved lives, who gave people hope. Surely, there was an explanation for everything. But explanations can only go so far. And in Greystone, the cracks in Dr. Harper's perfect image were beginning to show. The people who loved him didn't realize it, but they were standing on the edge of a nightmare. And when the truth finally came to light, it would be too late to turn back. For now, though, the mask remained firmly in place. Dr. Harper continued to walk the streets of Greystone, his smile as warm as ever, his voice as soothing as a lullaby. But behind that smile was a man no one truly knew. A man whose secrets would one day change everything. Greystone was a town that could have come straight out of a postcard. Nestled between rolling green hills and shaded by dense forests, it was a place where life moved slowly and neighbors greeted each other by name. The streets were paved with red bricks, uneven in places but full of character. Flower boxes hung under the windows of cozy cafes, their bright blossoms adding splashes of color to the quiet town square. In the mornings, you could hear the sound of church bells ringing, a soft melody that echoed through the air and reminded everyone that life in Greystone was as steady as it was simple. The town's charm wasn't just in its scenery but in its people. Greystone was small enough that everyone knew each other, and small enough that secrets rarely stayed hidden. Yet, in this peaceful corner of the world, there was one man who seemed almost too perfect. Dr. William Harper. Dr. Harper wasn't just respected in Greystone, he was admired. He had been the town's doctor for over 20 years, a man with a gentle smile and a voice that could calm even the most anxious patients. People spoke of him with affection, like he was part of their families. Dr. Harper saved my mother, one person might say. He delivered my firstborn, another would add. It seemed everyone in Greystone had a story of how Dr. Harper had touched their lives. Every Sunday, he sat in the front pew at church, bowing his head in quiet prayer. He attended every community event, whether it was a fundraiser for the local school or a charity dinner to help a struggling family. And his generosity went beyond showing up, he often donated money, supplies, and time. When the town's free health clinic was at risk of shutting down, Dr. Harper stepped in, offering to fund it himself. He's the kind of man you don't find anymore, people would say. Greystone's lucky to have him. But no one is perfect, not even Dr. Harper. For years, small things had been noticed in Greystone, though no one dared to say them out loud. It started as murmurs, whispered over cups of coffee at the local diner or during quiet moments after church. Patients who visited Dr. Harper sometimes didn't return. At first, it was easy to explain away. Greystone was a small town, but it wasn't uncommon for people to leave. Young men and women often moved to the city, chasing jobs or dreams. Elderly patients who passed away were simply assumed to have been cared for by Dr. Harper until the end. And for anyone else, it was easy to imagine they had quietly slipped out of town, seeking a fresh start. But over time, the whispers grew harder to ignore. "Have you heard about Mrs. Walker?" someone might say. "She went to see Dr. Harper last month, but no one's seen her since." "Maybe she moved," someone else would reply. The answers were always simple, always logical. After all, Dr. Harper wasn't the kind of man anyone would suspect. He was kind, generous, and deeply rooted in the town. If something was amiss, surely he wasn't involved. The people of Greystone trusted Dr. Harper completely. He had earned that trust through years of tireless work. When a patient went to him, they believed they were in safe hands. His clinic was always spotless, with neatly arranged medical tools and the faint scent of disinfectant. His office was lined with books on medicine, their spines worn from years of use. Everything about him seemed professional, reliable, and honest. Even when patients didn't return, people found ways to justify it. It was easier to believe they had their reasons for leaving than to question the man who had saved so many lives. Dr. Harper's charm made it even harder to doubt him. He remembered people's names, their children, even their pets. If someone came to him with a problem, he listened attentively, nodding thoughtfully as if their concerns were the most important thing in the world. "I'm here for you," he would say, his voice steady and reassuring. And everyone believed him. But not everyone in Greystone was so quick to dismiss the whispers. A few people began to feel uneasy, though they couldn't quite explain why. Nurse Rachel Sullivan was one of them. She had worked alongside Dr. Harper for 5 years and admired him deeply. But over time, she started noticing small things that didn't sit right. There were patient files that seemed incomplete, their details vague or missing entirely. There were late nights when Dr. Harper stayed behind at the clinic long after the last patient had left, the lights in his office glowing well into the early hours. And there were questions he didn't seem to want to answer, brushing them off with a smile and a quick change of subject. Rachel wasn't the only one who noticed. Others in the clinic occasionally brought up the odd gaps in patient records or the patients who seemed to vanish without a trace. But each time, the concerns were dismissed. "Dr. Harper is a busy man," one nurse would say. "He's got a lot on his plate." And that was true. Dr. Harper's workload was enormous. It made sense that things might fall through the cracks. But for Rachel, the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. The people of Greystone didn't share Rachel's concerns. To them, Dr. Harper was a hero, a man who had given so much to the community. He had delivered their children, cured their illnesses, and comforted them during their darkest hours. When someone mentioned the patients who had disappeared, others were quick to defend him. "It's not fair to point fingers at him," one woman said. "Dr. Harper has done more for this town than anyone else ever could." And so, the whispers faded, buried under layers of trust and admiration. But trust, like a mask, can hide the truth. Dr. Harper continued his work as if nothing had changed. He still greeted everyone with a warm smile. He still prayed in the front pew at church. And he still stayed late at the clinic, his office light glowing in the darkness like a beacon. But beneath the surface, the cracks were beginning to show. The whispers in Greystone hadn't disappeared entirely. They were still there, quiet and persistent, waiting for someone brave enough to listen, and for Dr. Harper, the mask he wore so carefully was beginning to slip. Nurse Rachel Sullivan had always looked up to Dr. Harper. In her 5 years at Greystone Medical Center, she had seen him do what others couldn't. His calm under pressure, his kindness toward patients, and his willingness to help anyone in need made him a figure of admiration. If Rachel ever doubted her ability to handle a tough day, she only needed to glance at Dr. Harper and feel reassured. But lately, something felt different. Dr. Harper wasn't the same. His usual warmth had cooled. He still smiled, but it didn't feel as genuine. His responses to questions were shorter, sometimes vague. He seemed distracted, his thoughts elsewhere. At first, Rachel assumed it was just stress. The clinic was busy, and Dr. Harper often worked late into the night. Even he must get tired, she told herself. Then she began noticing small, strange details. Rachel's job often involved organizing patient records. She was good at it, careful, efficient, and thorough. But as she reviewed files, she began to notice gaps. Some patient records didn't have clear outcomes. A visit would be documented, but there was no follow-up, no discharge note, no explanation for why the file seemed incomplete. At first, she thought it was a simple oversight. Doctors were busy, and paperwork wasn't always their priority. But the gaps became more frequent. Some files were missing entirely. Patients she remembered seeing in the clinic weren't in the system at all. It didn't make sense. One evening, she stayed late to finish a backlog of filing. The clinic was quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. As she flipped through a stack of folders, her hand stopped on one that felt out of place. It was thin, with only a single sheet of paper inside. At the top, in Dr. Harper's neat handwriting, were the words, Patient 47, Observations Ongoing. There was no name. No medical history. No test results. Nothing. Just that one cryptic note. Rachel frowned, her pulse quickening. Who was patient 47? Why weren't there any details? She turned to her computer, hoping to find more information. Typing, patient 47, into the hospital database, she hit search. The screen blinked. No results found. Rachel tried again, this time searching through the clinic's appointment logs. Nothing. It was as if patient 47 didn't exist. Determined to find answers, Rachel went to Dr. Harper's office. She knew he sometimes kept additional notes there, especially for more complicated cases. The door was unlocked, the room dimly lit by the glow of a desk lamp. The office was exactly as she expected, tidy, organized, with shelves of medical books and framed certificates on the walls. But when she opened the drawers of his desk, she found nothing unusual. Pens, paper, patient forms. No sign of anything related to patient 47. Then she noticed a small, locked drawer near the bottom of the desk. Unlike the others, this one had a heavy metal lock. Rachel hesitated, her heart racing. She had never seen Dr. Harper use this drawer before. What could he be keeping in there? She didn't have the key, and even if she did, opening it felt like a line she wasn't ready to cross, yet. The next morning, Rachel decided to bring up her discovery with a colleague. Nurse Emily was one of the most experienced staff members at the clinic, someone Rachel trusted. I found something strange in the files last night, Rachel said, lowering her voice. A patient listed as patient 47. No name, no details, just observations ongoing. And I couldn't find anything in the system. It's like they don't exist. Emily raised an eyebrow but didn't look particularly concerned. It's probably just an old note Harper forgot to update. You know how busy he is. But the file wasn't normal, Rachel insisted. And what about the missing records? I've noticed other gaps too. Patients who don't have outcomes, appointments with no follow-up. Emily sighed. Rachel, you're overthinking. This place runs on chaos half the time. Paperwork gets misplaced, files get lost. It happens. Don't go making a problem where there isn't one. Rachel nodded, but her unease only grew. Emily's dismissal didn't feel right. Sure, mistakes happened. But this wasn't just one file or one missing note. It was a pattern, and patterns didn't lie. Over the next few weeks, Rachel kept her observations to herself but began paying closer attention. She watched as patients came into the clinic, noting their names, their conditions, and whether they returned for follow-ups. Most did. But a few didn't. One patient in particular stood out. A young woman named Lily Crawford. She had come in for a routine checkup, nothing serious, just a sore throat and some fatigue. Rachel had been the one to check her vitals and take her history. Lily had been cheerful, joking about how she was probably overreacting. But better safe than sorry, right? She'd said with a laugh. Dr. Harper had seen her after that. Rachel remembered him walking her to the door, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as he spoke in his usual calming tone. But when Rachel tried to find Lily's file a week later, it wasn't there. Do you remember Lily Crawford? Rachel asked Emily one afternoon. The name sounds familiar. Why? She came in a few weeks ago. But I can't find her file. Maybe she didn't need a follow-up. Rachel frowned. But shouldn't her initial visit still be in the system? Emily shrugged. If it's missing, it's probably just a glitch. The database acts up all the time. But Rachel couldn't let it go. She remembered Lily's smile, the sound of her laugh. patients didn't just disappear. Rachel's unease began to consume her. She started arriving early and staying late, searching through files, trying to piece together a puzzle no one else seemed to see. Every gap she found, every missing name, felt like another piece falling into place. She didn't want to believe that something was wrong. She didn't want to doubt Dr. Harper. He was the backbone of Greystone, the man everyone trusted. But the more she looked, the more she realized that trust might be misplaced. And then there was the locked drawer. Every time she passed his office, she thought about it. What was inside? What was he hiding? Rachel didn't have answers yet, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Dr. William Harper's life, on the surface, was a picture of success. The townspeople of Greystone saw a man who had it all: intelligence, kindness, and a steadfast commitment to healing others. But what they didn't see was the shadowy past that shaped him, a history that whispered through the cracks of his perfect image. William was born into a world of struggle. His childhood unfolded in a gritty neighborhood where hope was hard to find. The streets were lined with crumbling buildings and filled with the echoes of sirens and shouting. Life in that part of the city wasn't kind. It wasn't fair. Violence and despair seemed like constants, like the air you couldn't help but breathe. His mother, Grace Harper, was the one bright spot in that dark world. She was a nurse, a woman with gentle hands and an unshakable determination. She worked long hours at the local clinic, patching up the wounded and soothing the sick. Her tired eyes would light up whenever she talked about her work. She believed in the power of medicine, not just to heal bodies, but to heal lives. Grace was William's hero. She taught him how to find strength in the chaos. She read him books about anatomy, teaching him the marvels of the human body. Medicine is more than science, she would say. It's about giving people hope when they need it most. William idolized her. When other kids played with toys, he was by her side, flipping through her medical journals and asking endless questions. He wanted to be like her. He wanted to make people feel safe, to be the light in their darkest moments. But life doesn't always go as planned. William was only 12 when his world shattered. It was a rainy evening, the kind where the streets glistened like mirrors under the streetlights. Grace had just finished her shift at the clinic and was walking home, carrying a bag of groceries for dinner. She never made it. A robbery gone wrong, those were the words the police used later. A desperate man with a gun, a scuffle in the rain, and a single shot that echoed through the night. Grace Harper was gone, her life stolen in an instant. When William heard the news, something inside him broke. The world became a colder place. The streets that once seemed tough but bearable now felt suffocating. His mother, the one person who had made him believe in goodness, was gone. Without Grace, William was left to navigate life on his own. His father was never in the picture, and there were no relatives willing to take him in. The world he had once dreamed of saving now felt like a cruel, unrelenting force. But William didn't let himself crumble. Instead, he turned to the one thing he still had, his ambition. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Medicine gives hope, she had said. He clung to that idea like a lifeline. He buried himself in his schoolwork. While other kids laughed and played, William spent his days with his nose in textbooks and his nights poring over borrowed library books. He excelled in every subject, especially science. Teachers marveled at his focus, his intelligence, and his drive. But what they didn't see was the loneliness. The grief. The anger. William had learned how to hide his emotions. He knew that showing weakness would only invite trouble. So he wore a mask, a calm, focused demeanor that kept people at a distance. By the time William reached medical school, he had perfected the art of appearing normal. To his professors, he was a brilliant, dedicated student. To his classmates, he was the quiet, helpful one who always seemed to have the answers. But inside, he was a man divided. On one hand, there was the part of him that truly cared about medicine. He wanted to save lives, just like his mother had. He wanted to be someone people could trust. But on the other hand, there was the part of him that felt nothing. The part that viewed people as puzzles to be solved, as problems to be fixed or discarded. His years of isolation had made him cold, calculating. Emotions were messy, inefficient. Medicine became both a passion and a tool. It was a way to honor his mother's legacy, but it was also a way to control the chaos he hated so much. In the sterile, orderly world of hospitals, William found a place where he could thrive. When William finally became Dr. Harper, he was exactly what people expected him to be: smart, kind, and compassionate. He wore his mask so well that no one ever questioned what lay beneath it. In Greystone, he quickly became a beloved figure. His patients adored him for his gentle touch and warm smile. They didn't see the emptiness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. They didn't notice how quickly he changed the subject when someone asked about his past. Dr. Harper had learned how to be what people wanted him to be. He could comfort a crying child, reassure a worried mother, and stand solemnly at a funeral. But inside, he felt detached, as if he were watching life from behind a glass wall. Despite his success, the cracks in William's carefully constructed persona began to show. The cold, calculating part of him grew stronger. He started seeing patterns in his patients, recognizing vulnerabilities that others might overlook. At first, it was harmless, or so he told himself. He'd notice how a patient flinched when he asked about their home life, or how another avoided eye contact when discussing their symptoms. But over time, his curiosity grew darker. What made people tick? What pushed them to their limits? What could he do with the power he held in his hands, the power to heal or harm? Dr. Harper began keeping notes. Detailed, meticulous notes about his patients. Not just their medical histories, but their fears, their secrets, their weaknesses. He told himself it was for research, for science. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The line between doctor and observer began to blur. And once it did, there was no turning back. By the time Dr. Harper had built his life in Greystone, he was a man of opposites. To the world, he was kind and caring, the very definition of a good doctor. But inside, he was something else entirely: cold, detached, and endlessly curious about the darker side of human nature. He wore his mask flawlessly, never letting anyone see the truth. But masks can only hide so much. Sooner or later, cracks begin to form. And in Greystone, those cracks were about to widen. Detective Eric Miller arrived in Greystone with the hope of escaping his past. The city, with its relentless pace and the haunting cases he had handled, had worn him down. Greystone promised something different: a slower rhythm, friendly faces, and the kind of cases that didn't keep you awake at night. But as Eric unpacked his boxes and settled into his modest house near the edge of town, he couldn't shake the feeling that life rarely went as planned. He was only a week into his new job when the call came in. A teenage girl named Lily Crawford had gone missing. She had visited Dr. Harper's clinic for a checkup the day before, but she never made it home. Her parents, desperate and tearful, insisted this wasn't like Lily. "She's not the kind of girl who would just run away," her mother said, clutching a photograph of her daughter. The case didn't immediately stand out. Teenagers ran away all the time, even in a town like Greystone. Some came back within days, others didn't. But something about Lily's disappearance gnawed at Eric. Maybe it was the way her parents described her: happy, responsible, with no signs of trouble at home. Or maybe it was the lack of any clear evidence: no note, no witnesses, no sign of where she could have gone. Eric decided to start at the last place Lily had been seen, Dr. Harper's clinic. The clinic was as ordinary as they came, a modest building with clean white walls and neatly trimmed shrubs out front. Inside, the receptionist greeted Eric with a polite but puzzled smile. "Is something wrong, detective?" I'm looking into Lily Crawford's disappearance, Eric said, his tone professional but firm. She had an appointment here yesterday. I'd like to speak with Dr. Harper. Dr. Harper appeared a few minutes later, his calm demeanor unshaken by the detective's visit. Detective Miller, welcome to Greystone, he said warmly, extending a hand. His voice was soothing, the kind that instantly put people at ease. I heard about Lily. It's a terrible thing. How can I help? Eric explained the purpose of his visit, watching Harper closely for any sign of unease. But Harper was composed, his answers measured. Yes, Lily came in yesterday, Harper said. She had a mild fever and some fatigue. Nothing serious. I prescribed her some vitamins and suggested rest. She seemed fine when she left. Did she mention anything unusual? Any plans to meet someone? Anything at all? Eric pressed. No, nothing like that, Harper replied, shaking his head. She seemed like a lovely young woman, though. I hope you find her soon. There was nothing in Harper's words or manner to suggest he was hiding anything. But as Eric left the clinic, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Back at his office, Eric began reviewing missing persons reports from the last decade. Greystone was a small town, and disappearances were rare, but as he dug deeper, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Lily Crawford wasn't the first. Over the past 10 years, there had been a handful of cases, individuals who had vanished without a trace. There was no apparent connection between the victims. They were of different ages, genders, and backgrounds. But as Eric combed through the files, one detail stood out: all of them had visited Dr. Harper's clinic shortly before they disappeared. A chill ran down Eric's spine. Could it be a coincidence? Dr. Harper was the town's only doctor. It made sense that many people in Greystone would have been his patients. But the timing was too consistent to ignore. Eric decided to revisit the clinic, this time focusing on the staff. He spoke with nurses, receptionists, and other employees, asking if they had noticed anything unusual. Most had nothing to report, but one nurse hesitated before answering. I don't know if this means anything, she said carefully, but I've noticed some patient records missing. It's probably just a clerical error, but it's happened more than once. Eric's mind raced. Missing records? Patients disappearing? The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though it was one he wasn't ready to face. That evening, Eric sat at his desk, staring at the files spread out before him. He felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. If his suspicions were wrong, he risked accusing a man who was deeply respected in the community. But if he was right, the consequences were far more chilling. Eric decided to dig deeper into Dr. Harper's past. What he found only added to his unease. Harper's records were spotless, too spotless. There were no complaints, no controversies, nothing that stood out. It was as if his life had been carefully curated, free of any flaws. The perfection felt unnatural. Determined to find answers, Eric obtained a warrant to access more detailed patient records from the clinic. It was a bold move, one that could draw suspicion if he was wrong, but he knew he couldn't stop now. As he sifted through the files, the pattern became clearer. The missing patients had more in common than just their visits to the clinic. Many of them had routine appointments, nothing life-threatening, nothing that would explain their sudden disappearances. And in each case, the final notes in their files were brief, almost dismissive. Eric also found something that made his blood run cold. In several files, there were handwritten notes by Dr. Harper, similar to the one in Lily's case. The notes were vague but chilling, observations complete. By now, Eric couldn't deny the possibility that something was very wrong. But he needed more than suspicion. He needed proof. He began interviewing the families of the missing, piecing together their final days. Each story added another layer to the mystery. A young man who had gone in for a sports injury and never came home. An elderly woman who had visited the clinic for a checkup and vanished. Each case seemed ordinary at first glance, but the details never quite added up. Eric also kept a close eye on Dr. Harper. He noticed how the doctor carried himself with unwavering confidence, how he deflected questions with ease, how he always seemed to have the perfect explanation. It was unsettling how normal he appeared. One night, Eric received an anonymous tip. A trembling voice on the other end of the line whispered, "If you want to know the truth about Dr. Harper, look in the basement of the clinic." The call ended abruptly, leaving Eric with more questions than answers. But it was enough to set his plan in motion. Eric knew he couldn't confront Harper directly, not yet. Instead, he decided to watch and wait, hoping that the doctor would slip up. And as the days passed, the noose tightened. The deeper Eric dug, the more certain he became that Dr. Harper wasn't the man everyone thought he was. The missing patients, the vague notes, the anonymous tip, it all pointed to something dark lurking beneath the surface. For now, Harper remained untouchable, his mask of kindness and competence firmly in place. But Eric was determined. He wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth, no matter how horrifying it turned out to be. Rachel's unease had been building for weeks. The missing records, the vague explanations, and Dr. Harper's increasingly strange behavior gnawed at her. She couldn't explain why she felt so certain that something was wrong, but the feeling had become impossible to ignore. One evening, she decided to stay late at the clinic. She pretended to be catching up on paperwork, though her real goal was to observe Dr. Harper. The building was quiet, the usual bustle of patients and staff replaced by an eerie stillness. Rachel sat at her desk, her eyes flicking toward the hallway leading to Dr. Harper's office. As the clock ticked past 9 p.m., she heard the faint sound of footsteps. Peeking out cautiously, she saw Dr. Harper leaving his office. He was carrying a large black bag, his posture tense. He paused in the hallway, looking around as if to ensure no one was watching. Then he turned and headed toward the basement. Rachel's heart raced. She hesitated for a moment, debating whether to follow him. But curiosity, and a growing sense of dread, pushed her forward. Staying a safe distance behind, she moved quietly, her footsteps muffled by the clinic's polished floors. At the end of the dimly lit basement hallway, Dr. Harper stopped in front of a door she had never noticed before. The number on it read B13, a room she was certain wasn't on any clinic map she had seen. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and shut it behind him. Rachel lingered in the shadows, straining to hear any sounds coming from the other side, but the thick door muted everything. Minutes later, the door opened again. Dr. Harper emerged, the black bag no longer in his hand. His expression was unreadable as he locked the door and walked away, disappearing back up the stairs. Rachel waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before approaching the door. She tried the handle, but it was locked. Of course, she thought. Her mind raced as she remembered the hidden key she had found in Dr. Harper's office. Weeks ago. At the time, she hadn't known what it was for, but now she was almost certain it belonged to this door. The next day, Rachel arrived at the clinic early, long before anyone else. She went straight to Dr. Harper's office, her nerves on edge. The key was still where she had left it, hidden inside a hollowed-out book on his shelf. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, the cold metal feeling heavier than it should have. By the time she made her way back to room B13, her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. The basement was empty, the faint hum of the clinic's HVAC system the only sound. Rachel hesitated in front of the door, gripping the key tightly. Was she ready for what might be on the other side? She slid the key into the lock and turned it. The click echoed in the stillness, making her flinch. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. What she saw made her stomach churn. The room was cold and dimly lit, the faint glow of a single overhead bulb casting long shadows. In the center stood a metal table, its surface stained with dark, rust-colored smears. Surgical tools were scattered across a nearby tray, some clean, others crusted with dried blood. The air was thick with the metallic scent of iron and something else she couldn't place, something rotten. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of various sizes. Rachel stepped closer, her breath hitching as she realized what was inside them. Preserved tissues, organs, and other unidentifiable specimens floated in murky liquid, each jar labeled with a number. Her eyes fell on a stack of folders on a desk in the corner. She flipped through them quickly, her hands trembling. Each folder bore the name of a patient she recognized, names of people who had disappeared. The notes inside detailed strange, inhumane procedures. Words like experiment and specimen jumped out at her, making her stomach twist. Rachel felt her knees weaken. She stumbled back, her mind racing. How had no one seen this before? How had Dr. Harper hidden something so horrifying right under their noses? She needed to leave, to tell someone, to expose whatever this was. But as she turned toward the door, she froze. In the corner of the room, partially obscured by a sheet, was the black bag Dr. Harper had been carrying the night before. Rachel stared at it, her body rigid with fear. She didn't want to know what was inside, but she couldn't walk away without finding out. Slowly, she approached the bag, her breath shallow. Her hands shook as she unzipped it. Inside were blood-stained rags, surgical gloves, and a scalpel. Beneath them was something worse, a small glass jar, empty except for a label that read, 47, complete. Rachel dropped the bag and stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She couldn't stay here any longer. She grabbed the folder she had been reading and fled, her footsteps echoing through the empty basement. As Rachel climbed the stairs, she tried to steady her breathing. She couldn't let anyone see her panic. She needed to think, to figure out what to do next. But one thing was clear, Dr. Harper wasn't the man they all thought he was. The door to room B13 swung shut behind her, its secrets momentarily hidden. But Rachel knew she couldn't keep this to herself. She had uncovered something far darker than she ever could have imagined, and the man she had once trusted was at the center of it all. Rachel stood frozen in the doorway of room B13, her breath caught in her throat. The cold air hit her face, carrying with it a metallic tang that made her stomach churn. The dim light from a single flickering bulb above cast long, distorted shadows across the room. It took her a moment to register what she was seeing, but once she did, her body tensed with a mix of fear and revulsion. The first thing that drew her eyes was the table in the center of the room. It was large, made of steel, with thick restraints attached to its sides. The surface was stained, splattered with dark, dried patches that could only be blood. Rachel felt her knees weaken as she imagined what might have taken place there. Next to the table was a tray of surgical tools. Some were neatly arranged as if prepared for use, while others lay haphazardly, crusted with what looked like old blood. The contrast was chilling, tools meticulously cleaned alongside those that seemed abandoned mid-use. Scalpel blades, clamps, syringes, and instruments Rachel couldn't even name filled the tray. Her eyes moved to the walls. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, each lined with glass jars. The jars glistened under the weak light, their contents floating in a cloudy liquid. Rachel took a step closer, morbid curiosity overcoming her fear. She gasped as she realized what was inside them. The jars contained tissue, organs, and other unidentifiable parts of the human body. Some were small, like fingers or pieces of skin. Others were larger, hearts, livers, even pieces of bone. Each jar was carefully labeled with a number and a date. The neatness of it all, the clinical precision, made it even more horrifying. This wasn't a mistake or a rush of madness. It was deliberate. In the far corner of the room, a small desk stood cluttered with papers and folders. Rachel's hands trembled as she approached, unsure if she wanted to know what they contained. She pulled out the top folder, her fingers brushing against the thick, rough paper. The label on the front read, Subject 19, Phase 2. Flipping it open, Rachel was greeted by page after page of detailed notes. The handwriting was neat, precise, and unmistakably Dr. Harper's. The first page listed basic information, the patient's age, gender, and health condition. But the rest of the file was unlike anything she had ever seen. The notes described procedures in cold, scientific terms, but the reality behind the words was monstrous. Initial incision at abdominal cavity to observe organ function under stress. Subject exhibited signs of distress, restrained for further observation. The words burned into her mind. Rachel scanned through more pages, her eyes darting across diagrams, charts, and even photographs. Each image captured a moment of agony, patients strapped to the table, their faces contorted in pain. Some looked barely alive, their eyes wide with terror. Others were lifeless, their bodies twisted unnaturally. She couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive. Rachel forced herself to look at another folder. This one was labeled, Subject 32, Terminated. The notes were colder, more detached. They detailed the final moments of another patient, as if describing a broken machine being dismantled. Vital signs ceased at 3:14 a.m. Experiment deemed a failure. Tissue samples preserved for future study. Her stomach twisted. These weren't patients. They were experiments. Rachel's eyes flicked back to the shelves of jars. The numbers on them matched the subjects in the files. Each jar represented a person who had come to the clinic for help, only to end up here, reduced to a label, a specimen. She stepped closer to the shelves, her hand brushing against the cool glass of one jar. Inside was a small, shriveled organ floating in a yellowish liquid. The label read, Subject 12, Liver Sample. Her gaze moved to another jar, this one containing a mass of tangled tissue. Its label read, Subject 47, Complete. Rachel's breath hitched. Subject 47. The name she had seen in that mysterious file weeks ago. The same file that had led her to this nightmare. This wasn't just a room of horrors, it was a graveyard, a chilling archive of Dr. Harper's atrocities. Rachel's hands were shaking, but she forced herself to pull out her phone. She had to document this. The people of Greystone had to know the truth. She began snapping photos, her flash lighting up the room in bursts that made the shadows dance. She took pictures of the table, the tools, the jars, and the files. Her phone buzzed as each image saved, but the sound felt distant, drowned out by the pounding of her heart. As she photographed the jars, she felt tears sting her eyes. These were people. They had families, friends, lives. And they had trusted Dr. Harper, just as everyone in Greystone did. The thought made her stomach churn. Rachel knew she couldn't stay long. Dr. Harper could return at any moment. She slipped a few of the folders into her bag, choosing the ones with the most damning evidence. As she prepared to leave, Rachel noticed something else, a locked cabinet in the corner. It was small, unassuming, almost easy to miss in the chaos of the room. But something about it drew her attention. She hesitated, debating whether to try to open it. But time was running out, and she couldn't risk being caught. Rachel turned and hurried back to the door, her bag heavy with the stolen files. Her mind raced as she made her way up the stairs. What she had seen was worse than anything she could have imagined. Dr. Harper wasn't just unethical, he was a monster. He had taken the trust of his patients and twisted it into something unspeakable. Back in her car, Rachel sat gripping the steering wheel, her heart still pounding. She didn't know what to do next. Who would believe her? Dr. Harper was loved, respected, untouchable. But she had the evidence now. She had the proof. As she stared at the darkened clinic, one thing became clear, the truth about Dr. Harper had to come out, no matter the cost. The horrors of B-13 would not stay hidden forever. Detective Eric Miller had seen many unsettling cases in his career, but none had prepared him for what was unfolding in Greystone. The small town was supposed to be a break from the chaos he had left behind in the city, a quiet place where people knew each other and life moved at a slower pace. But the deeper he dug into the disappearances surrounding Dr. William Harper, the more he realized this case was anything but ordinary. It started with patterns. Detective Miller wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but as he examined the missing persons reports, a troubling trend emerged. All the victims had visited Dr. Harper's clinic shortly before they vanished. Each case, on its own, could be explained away: an elderly woman presumed dead, a teenager thought to have run away, a young man suspected of moving to the city without notice. But together, the coincidences were impossible to ignore. Determined to find answers, Miller began investigating Dr. Harper's life. On the surface, Harper appeared spotless. His clinic was well regarded, his patients loved him, and his contributions to the community were celebrated. But Miller knew appearances could be deceiving. He dug into property records, searching for anything that might reveal another side to the doctor. That's when he found it, a piece of land just outside town, tucked away at the end of a dirt road. The property had been in Harper's family for decades, passed down to him after the death of his parents. It wasn't listed under the clinic's business records or Harper's known assets. Most people in Greystone didn't even seem to know it existed. The more Miller learned, the more suspicious the property became. No one had reported seeing Harper there, but the remote location and its secrecy sent a chill down his spine. He had seen this kind of hidden place before, in cases where people wanted to keep their darkest secrets buried, literally. Miller knew he couldn't search the property without a warrant. He needed evidence, and that's where Rachel Sullivan came in. Rachel, a nurse at Harper's clinic, had uncovered disturbing photos and files from the hidden room B13 in the basement. The images she provided showed jars containing human tissues, strange tools, and incomplete patient records. Combined with the missing persons reports, the photos were enough to convince a judge that something sinister was happening. The warrant came through 2 days later. Miller assembled a small team, each member briefed on what little they knew. A respected doctor was connected to a series of disappearances, and the property outside town might hold answers. The detective didn't share his full suspicions with the team, he couldn't. The truth was, even he didn't fully know what they were walking into. The drive to the property was unsettling. The paved roads of Greystone gave way to uneven gravel, then to a narrow dirt path surrounded by thick trees. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Even the sound of birds and insects seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of Miller's neck stand up. When they arrived, the property was exactly as he had imagined, remote, overgrown, and eerily quiet. The house, if it could be called that, was a small, weathered structure with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. Behind it was an old shed, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Miller's team spread out, their footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. They were careful, methodical, knowing that every step they took might uncover something they couldn't unsee. Miller approached the house first, pushing open the creaking door. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust and decay. The furniture was sparse, just a table, a few chairs, and a couch that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it was the items on the table that caught Miller's attention. There were surgical tools laid out in a neat row, their metallic surfaces gleaming even in the dim light. Next to them were jars similar to the ones Rachel had photographed in room B13. Miller's stomach churned as he recognized the same yellowish liquid and preserved tissues inside. Each jar was labeled, the handwriting matching the notes Rachel had found. On the far wall was a bookshelf filled with journals. Miller pulled one out, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the entries detailing medical procedures that made his blood run cold. These weren't treatments, they were experiments. The notes described the effects of various conditions on the human body, observations of pain thresholds, and chilling phrases like subject terminated and specimen preserved. While Miller examined the house, one of his team members called out from behind the property. "Detective! You need to see this." Miller followed the voice to the shed. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. As he stepped inside, the smell hit him first, a sickening combination of rot and chemicals. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The floor of the shed was covered in dirt, but there were patches where the ground had been disturbed. Shallow graves. Miller's team began carefully digging, and what they unearthed confirmed his worst fears. Human remains, decomposed beyond recognition, were wrapped in plastic sheets. Each grave seemed hastily dug, as if the person burying them had been in a hurry. In the corner of the shed, a pile of discarded medical equipment lay hidden under a tarp. There were syringes, gloves, and stained surgical gowns. Beside them was a cooler filled with ice packs and more jars, some still sealed. Miller didn't want to open them, but he knew he had to. Inside were organs, each one meticulously labeled. Back in the house, Miller dove deeper into the journals. The more he read, the more he realized how calculated and methodical Dr. Harper's actions were. Each experiment was documented in detail, from the selection of the subject to the procedure itself and, in many cases, the subject's final moments. One entry caught his attention. It described a young woman, Lily Crawford. Miller's hands shook as he read the words, "Subject presented with mild fever. Ideal candidate for Phase 3. Observation complete. Tissue preserved." Lily hadn't run away. She hadn't wandered off or decided to leave town. She had been taken, lured into Dr. Harper's twisted world and reduced to nothing more than a specimen. By the time the search was over, Miller and his team had uncovered enough evidence to expose Dr. Harper for what he truly was. The shallow graves, the journals, the jars, it all painted a horrifying picture of a man who had used his position of trust to commit unspeakable acts. As Miller stood outside the property, staring at the house and shed, he couldn't shake the weight of what he had found. The quiet town of Greystone had trusted Dr. Harper completely, and he had betrayed them in the most horrifying way imaginable. The detective knew one thing for certain: the mask Dr. Harper had worn for so long was about to come off, and the entire town would see the monster that had been hiding in plain sight. Detective Eric Miller knew that catching Dr. Harper wouldn't be easy. The man wasn't just intelligent, he was calculating, always staying one step ahead. Harper's charm and reputation made him untouchable in the eyes of most people in Greystone. But Miller had the evidence, and he had a plan. Rachel Sullivan, the brave nurse who had uncovered Harper's secrets, agreed to play a key role. She had already risked so much by exposing the horrors in Room B13, but now she was willing to put herself in danger to help bring Harper down. Miller admired her courage. She was the only person who could get close enough to Harper to set the trap. The plan was simple but risky. Rachel would ask Harper to meet her in the hospital's basement, claiming she needed his help with a patient file she didn't understand. The basement, dimly lit and rarely visited at night, was the perfect place to corner him without drawing attention. Miller and his team would be waiting nearby, ready to act the moment Harper arrived. Before they began, Miller pulled Rachel aside. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I do," Rachel replied, her expression resolute. "He needs to be stopped." Miller nodded. "Stay calm. Stick to the plan. We'll be there the moment things go wrong." Rachel took a deep breath and walked down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. Rachel stood in the basement, the dim light casting long shadows on the cold concrete walls. She clutched a clipboard in her hands, her heart pounding as she rehearsed her lines. She didn't have to wait long. Footsteps echoed down the stairs, slow and deliberate. Rachel turned to see Dr. Harper descending, his face calm but unreadable. He smiled as he approached her, but something about the way he moved sent chills down her spine. "Rachel," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I wasn't expecting to see you here so late. What's this about?" Rachel held up the clipboard, doing her best to appear casual. "I found this file, and it doesn't make sense. I thought you might be able to explain it to me." Harper stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been very curious lately, haven't you?" he said, his tone soft but laced with something cold and unsettling. Rachel froze. Her grip on the clipboard tightened, her palms slick with sweat. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Harper's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Rachel. Haven't you heard the saying? Sometimes it's better not to know." Before Harper could say more, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the basement. Miller and his team emerged from the shadows, their weapons drawn. The bright beams of their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating Harper's startled face. "Dr. William Harper," Miller said, his voice firm and commanding. "You're under arrest." For a moment, Harper's mask slipped. His eyes darted between Miller and the officers, then back to Rachel. But instead of panicking, he did something that sent a shiver down everyone's spine. He smiled. It wasn't a smile of fear or defeat. It was calm, confident, and full of chilling certainty. "You've gone to so much trouble," Harper said, his voice steady and almost amused. "But do you really think this is where it ends?" Miller stepped forward, his weapon trained on Harper. "Hands where I can see them. Now." Harper didn't resist. He slowly raised his hands, still smiling. "You found me, detective. But you're only scratching the surface. There are others. Many others." Miller's jaw tightened. He had spent weeks unraveling Harper's crimes, uncovering the horrors hidden in Room B-13 and the property outside of town. But the way Harper spoke, so calmly, so knowingly, made him question if this was just the beginning of something much larger. "What are you talking about?" Miller demanded. Harper tilted his head, his expression almost pitying. "You've done well, detective. But the truth is far bigger than me. Do you think I worked alone? Do you think my methods are unique?" He chuckled softly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Rachel, standing frozen near the wall, felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. Harper wasn't bluffing. The way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, it was as if he knew something no one else did. Miller's team moved quickly to restrain Harper, cuffing his hands and leading him toward the stairs. But even as they led him away, Harper continued to speak. "You're chasing shadows," he said, his voice echoing in the narrow stairwell. "You'll never find them all. And even if you do, there will always be more. People like me are everywhere." As the officers led Harper out of the building, Rachel stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing. She had been so focused on exposing Harper, on stopping him, that she hadn't considered the possibility of others. Miller approached her, his face grim. "You okay?" Rachel nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "What did he mean? About others?" Miller shook his head. "I don't know. But we'll find out." The basement fell silent once Harper was gone, but the weight of his words lingered. Miller stood alone in the dim light, staring at the empty table where Harper had stood just moments ago. He had solved the case, or so he thought. But Harper's final message haunted him. The man wasn't just a criminal, he was part of something larger, something darker. As Miller walked back up the stairs, his resolve hardened. The fight wasn't over. Harper had been caught, but the shadows he hinted at were still out there. And Miller knew one thing for certain, he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the full truth. The trial of Dr. William Harper became the most shocking event Greystone had ever witnessed. People from across the country filled the courtroom, desperate to see the man they had once admired brought to justice. For the residents of Greystone, it was unthinkable that someone so trusted, someone they had called a friend, could commit such horrifying crimes. The courtroom buzzed with tension on the first day of the trial. Harper, dressed in a crisp prison uniform, walked in calmly, his expression unreadable. He didn't look like a monster. He still had the same composed demeanor, the same polished charm that had fooled so many for so long. When the charges were read, kidnapping, murder, illegal experimentation, the gasps in the room were audible. Families of the missing wept openly. Rachel Sullivan sat near the back, her face pale and her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She didn't know if she could bear to hear what Harper would say. And then he spoke. Dr. Harper's voice was as calm as ever, but his words sent chills through the room. He described his actions with cold precision, explaining each experiment, each procedure, as though he were presenting a medical lecture. He showed no emotion, no regret. "The human body is full of secrets," he said at one point, his tone almost philosophical. "I was simply uncovering them." His words made the audience shiver. For the families of his victims, it was unbearable. They had come hoping for answers, for some sign of remorse. Instead, they found a man who viewed their loved ones as little more than tools for his twisted experiments. The prosecutor, visibly shaken, accused Harper of being a heartless killer. But Harper didn't flinch. He simply smiled, a small, chilling smile that seemed to mock everyone in the room. For Rachel, the trial was too much. Every detail brought her back to room B13, to the jars, the files, the table in the center of that cold room. She had tried to move on, but the memories haunted her, creeping into her thoughts during the day and her dreams at night. After Harper's sentencing, Rachel packed her bags and left Greystone. The town, once her home, now felt tainted. Everywhere she went, she saw reminders of what had happened. The clinic where she had worked, the streets where she had walked, it all carried the weight of Harper's crimes. She moved to a new city, far away, hoping for a fresh start. But the nightmares followed her. She dreamed of the jars on the shelves, of Harper's smile, of the chilling words he had spoken during the trial. She tried therapy, new jobs, new hobbies, but nothing could erase what she had seen. Detective Eric Miller stayed in Greystone, though the case had left its mark on him as well. Harper's final words still echoed in his mind, "There are others." Miller couldn't shake the feeling that Harper hadn't been lying. The evidence suggested Harper had acted alone, but Miller had seen enough in his career to know there were always more shadows to uncover. Determined to ensure that no one else could do what Harper had done, Miller dedicated his career to investigating other cases of missing persons and unexplained crimes. He spent hours poring over cold cases, looking for connections, for patterns. His work took him far beyond Greystone. He spoke at conferences, shared his findings with other detectives, and built networks to hunt predators like Harper. Miller's days were filled with work, his nights with restless thoughts. He had stopped one monster, but how many more were still out there? Dr. William Harper was sentenced to life without parole. The public expected him to crumble in prison, to lose the composure he had held onto throughout his trial. But Harper remained eerily calm. He was a model inmate, polite to guards, quiet during meals, and cooperative during routine checks. But something about him unsettled everyone who crossed his path. It was the smile. Harper's smile never faded, a small, knowing curve of his lips that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words were deliberate, measured, as if he were still in control despite his confinement. Late at night, when the prison grew quiet, the guards swore they could hear him whispering. At first, they thought he might be talking to himself. But the whispers didn't sound random. They were rhythmic, deliberate, like he was reciting something. "What does he say?" one guard asked another. "I don't know," the other replied, his voice low. "But whatever it is, it's not right." Though Harper was locked away, the fear he had instilled lingered in Greystone. Families of his victims struggled to move on, haunted by the horrors they had learned. The clinic where Harper had worked was shut down, its doors boarded up, its windows collecting dust. No one wanted to set foot inside again. And yet, some couldn't let go of the feeling that Harper's crimes were only part of a larger story. His final words at the trial, his whispered comments to the guards, they hinted at something more, something yet to be uncovered. For now, Greystone tried to heal. But in the darkest corners of their minds, many wondered if the nightmare was truly over. And in his cell, William Harper waited, his chilling smile a reminder that some monsters never really go away.